All patients who receive cardiac implantable electronic devices need to be followed up. Pacemakers are no exception. And we know that remote monitoring is preferred. And those are the HRS recommendations in 2015, and that included pacemakers. Biotronic was the first to provide remote monitoring with pacemakers, and the other manufacturers came with remote monitoring for their Brady devices relatively later. I think pacemakers are no exception to other devices, and remote monitoring is preferred for them. And that is both that preference and the fact that remote monitoring has become more available in Brady devices is reflected in a recent Medicare analysis from the US, where in fact remote monitoring was the largest expanding sector for pacemakers. Pacemakers represented a 60% increase in remote monitoring services, whereas it was flat for other devices. The availability of remote monitoring has become less restricted in the pacemaker world. So there's also a perception that pacemaker patients don't require remote monitoring because they're less sick. I would suggest that this is another reason why they should be enabled with remote monitoring. So the reasons I think this is preferable is, first of all, for the clinic's point of view, and Matthew Swift outlined that if you have a large number of patients in whom you have to maintain follow-up, then remote monitoring is preferred for clinic efficiencies. So at our institution, we manage up to 60,000 evaluations of all devices per year. We simply cannot fit all those patients through the doors. And pacemakers represent the largest fraction of those patients. So it is much easier for the clinic to maintain remote monitoring as a means of follow-up for pacemaker patients. The other part of this is that it's easier for patients, and that is very important. So pacemaker patients are approximately a decade older than those with ICDs and CRTs. In the US, the average age is 75 years old. So that means they're less able to access clinic services. They often need an accompanying person. And pacemaker patients don't often have many comorbidities, often hypertension. So they don't have diabetes or heart failure. Point being that they don't come to the hospital that often. So simply coming for a routine pacemaker check is relatively unprofitable from their point of view. They're simply told everything is fine. So you have an elderly group of patients with restricted access, and remote monitoring is much easier for patients. I'd like to also emphasize that the purpose of monitoring is to manage the device and also accompanying diseases. So pacemaker patients have very reliable devices. I think the incidence of device malfunction is already very low. There's an order of magnitude lower in pacemaker patients. So the actionability of evaluations in pacemaker patients, that is the number of times that device reprogramming has to be conducted, is less than 2%. And that was shown in a recent trial, large randomized controlled trial, the Japan at Home trial. So again, the incidence of device malfunction is relatively low. The other part of monitoring is disease monitoring. And again, patients with pacemakers have a relatively low comorbidity burden. They're not coming to the hospital that often to see doctors. So it's easier for them to be monitored remotely. But amongst that group of patients, we are very interested in atrial fibrillation. And atrial fibrillation is asymptomatic often. It can be notified virtually immediately by home monitoring. And therefore, we can get information about a silent arrhythmia with potential significant clinical sequelae and enable early anticoagulation. So again, I think remote monitoring in the pacemaker population, elderly patients with hypertension, enables us to detect atrial fibrillation in particular and act on those data quickly. The actionability part of evaluation is the critical part, but overall, out of routine evaluations, only a fraction of those evaluations are actionable. Less than 2% for pacemakers, perhaps 7 or 8% for ICDs and CRTs. And that's not a useful way of utilizing clinic time. And the pandemic has actually concentrated our thoughts, because we all started thinking more heavily about which patients do we actually need to see and bring into hospital. And those are, of course, the ones with actionable events. So we have changed our practice to calling in the patients who have events that are notified by alerts. So really going up to alert-based care and reducing to a minimum routine evaluations. So this is something that we've been capable of all along with home monitoring, but we really started exercising that because of the pandemic. So this is a practice change. And I'd make a couple of points there. If we are going to simply alert-based care in terms of remote patient management, then it's important to be confident that connectivity is maintained. So we tested that in the TRUST trial, and remote monitoring using home monitoring provides daily packets of information. They're daily transmissions. And we noted that 90% of those daily transmissions were successfully received. And that has been a consistent number, consistent fraction across different continents, wherever home monitoring has been used. So this is a very reliable system. So I'm confident of practicing alert-based medicine for when I'm using home monitoring. The second part of that is that the alerts that are triggered with home monitoring are based on centralized analysis, not device-based analysis. So the processing power in a device is relatively limited, but the home monitoring server has no restrictions in terms of computing power. So we tested this in TRUST again. So of all the daily transmissions that were transmitted, 90% were received, but only 1 per patient per year, and this is an ICD population, was actually the basis of an alert. So the centralized system does produce a very successful filter. So the alert ultimately was about 50 to 60% clinically actionable. So I think these are very important ingredients for alert-based care: success of connectivity and the ability to define at what time the patient needs to be seen. That way we can see the patients that need to be seen, and at the same time reduce a lot of the invisible clinical work that accompanies remote care.